It was one of those perfect sunny afternoons in London, where the sky was bright and clear and a soft breeze floated through the air. The streets surrounding Buckingham Palace were alive with activity as tourists from every corner of the world gathered to witness one of the most iconic ceremonies in Britain, the changing of the guard. The palace, standing tall and majestic, looked every bit the royal residence it was, with its grand architecture and well-maintained grounds. This historic site always drew crowds, but today felt different. There was an energy in the air as if something special was about to happen. Among the excited visitors was a group of young tourists. They were from a variety of countries, all of them in their 20s, ready to experience the rich history and grandeur of London. Most of them were carrying cameras, eager to snap pictures of everything they could. As the ceremony was about to begin, the tourists lined up along the gates, eagerly chattering and laughing. But amidst the excitement, there was a certain group that caught the attention of those around them. The group was loud, their voices cutting through the normal hum of the crowd. They seemed to be making fun of the royal guards, a tradition that had been a part of British history for centuries. The guards, dressed in their famous red coats, tall black hats, and holding their rifles, were known for their stoic discipline and unwavering focus. They didn't react to anything around them. Not even the most outrageous jokes or insults seemed to shake them. But the tourists didn't seem to care. One of them, a young man with a bright yellow t-shirt, started making exaggerated gestures, mocking the serious expressions of the guards. His friends laughed loudly, thinking it was all in good fun. They began making loud comments about how the guards looked like statues, trying to provoke a response. At first they were simply trying to make jokes, but it soon escalated into something far less respectful. The group began to tease the guards, even commenting on their posture and the way they held their rifles. Some took pictures from angles that were clearly meant to make the guards look silly, as if they were somehow less important or less dignified than the royal family they protected. While some people in the crowd smiled awkwardly at the young tourists, hoping they would calm down, others were beginning to feel uncomfortable. It wasn't that the tourists were doing anything criminal, but they were certainly testing the limits of what was considered acceptable behavior. Most of the tourists around them kept a respectful distance, quietly observing the ceremony, but this group was different. They were determined to get a reaction out of the guards. One of the girls in the group, her camera always in hand, even started moving closer and closer to the horses, trying to snap close-up pictures. She seemed to think the horses, too, were part of the spectacle. The horses that accompanied the guards were no ordinary animals. They were large, strong, and equally disciplined, bred for these kinds of ceremonies. For centuries, these magnificent animals had stood alongside the guards, maintaining the same calm, unwavering demeanor as their riders. Horses were an important part of the British military, and many of them had been specially trained to remain calm, even in chaotic situations. The guards on horseback were a symbol of royal tradition and discipline, but these tourists had no interest in respecting that tradition. As the group continued to get closer, they began to taunt the horses, making loud noises and trying to touch them. One of the tourists, a young woman with dark hair, took it a step further. She extended her hand towards one of the horses, hoping to pet it. The horse, startled by the sudden movement, turned its head quickly and flicked its tail. The tourists laughed at the horse's reaction, as though it was part of a joke. They didn't seem to realize that the horse, like any animal, could feel threatened or annoyed by the sudden intrusion of personal space. Despite all of this, the guards remained completely still, just as they were trained to do. They didn't flinch or react to the tourists' behavior. Their faces remained expressionless, their focus entirely on their duty. It was as if the commotion around them didn't exist. Their stillness was a reminder of the royal traditions they upheld, a tradition that valued discipline, order, and respect for authority. They were part of something larger than themselves, something that demanded a high level of responsibility, and yet, despite the unruly behavior of the tourists, they did not respond. But the horses were a different matter. While the guards could stand motionless, the horses could not. These animals, trained to maintain composure under pressure, were still living beings with instincts. The more the tourists crowded around, the more the horses seemed to become agitated. They could feel the attention on them, feel the invasion of their space. Horses, especially royal ones, were not used to being harassed. They were used to standing proudly, showing off their grace and strength in parades, not being the subject of mockery. As the tourist continued to laugh and make fun of the situation, one of the guards turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the crowd. He had seen it all before. The tourists who thought it was funny to provoke the guards or their horses. He knew that his job was to stay silent, to maintain composure, and to show no reaction. But inside he couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration. He had witnessed disrespect from tourists countless times, and yet, it always amazed him how quickly people would forget the meaning of tradition. The young tourists, with their laughter echoing through the air, didn't seem to realize how serious the ceremony was. To them, it was a fun photo opportunity, a way to take funny pictures and make memories to share with friends back home. But to the guards and the horses, it was more than that. It was about duty, respect, and honoring centuries of tradition. And despite the teasing and the mockery, they carried out their duties without complaint. What the tourists didn't understand was that the royal guards and their horses had a responsibility far beyond entertaining them. They were part of a long-standing tradition, a symbol of the British monarchy and its history. The tourists were there for a few moments of fun and excitement, but the guards and horses had dedicated their lives to this tradition. It wasn't about making people laugh or getting a reaction out of them. It was about ensuring that the history and culture of Britain were preserved, and that respect for those traditions was maintained. As the group of tourists continued their antics, oblivious to the weight of their actions, the atmosphere began to shift. What started as lighthearted fun was slowly becoming more of a nuisance, and the other people watching could feel the tension building. It was clear that something was about to happen, but what that something would be, no one knew. The group of tourists, laughing and joking, had no idea that they were about to learn a valuable lesson about respect, authority, and the consequences of their behavior. The royal guards stood motionless, their red coats vivid against the bright backdrop of Buckingham Palace. Their tall black hats were almost as iconic as the palace itself, and the sharp, well-maintained rifles they held were a symbol of their serious duty. These guards were known for their silence, their discipline, and their ability to endure anything without showing even the slightest sign of emotion. Whether it was a crowded square filled with noisy tourists or a rare gust of wind that threatened to knock them off balance, the guards remained steady, focused, and unwavering in their commitment to their post. As the ceremony went on, the young tourists continued to act in a manner that made the atmosphere feel less like a respectful public event and more like a circus. The tourists were unaware of the gravity of what they were witnessing, thinking of the changing of the guard as just another tourist attraction, like any other show. They could not see the significance of the guards' actions, nor the dedication that each guard put into their role. Instead, they viewed it as an opportunity to make jokes, snap pictures, and act as if they were the main attraction of the day. The young man in the yellow t-shirt, who had been the ringleader of the group's antics, continued his attempts to make the guards break their stoic expressions. Every time he moved closer, the guard nearest to him stood even more still, making no movement to acknowledge his presence. There was something oddly impressive about their stillness, a kind of power that came from their absolute focus. It was clear that the guards were aware of the tourists around them, but they had been trained to ignore distractions, to remain calm and composed no matter what was happening. The tourists didn't seem to understand that this was no ordinary job. They didn't realize that the guards were not simply standing there to be admired, but that they had been chosen for their ability to handle the pressure of such a visible role. These men and women weren't just soldiers. They were symbols of history and tradition. They had undergone intense training to develop the ability to maintain a perfect stance for long periods of time, even under extreme conditions. The tourists didn't appreciate this. To them, it was just a funny scene in which they could participate. The tourist began to make more noise. The girl with the camera in her hand moved even closer to one of the horses, her eyes fixed on the horse's glossy mane and shining coat. She was trying to get a closer shot, and although the guard riding the horse was very much aware of her movements, he did nothing to stop her. He simply stayed still, his posture straight and disciplined. His horse, however, was starting to show signs of irritation. The animal, although well-trained, was beginning to sense that its space was being invaded. The horses, like the guards, were a key part of the ceremony. They had been trained for years, not only to march in perfect unison with the guards, but also to remain calm even in the most chaotic environments. The horses had a noble presence. They were strong and large, their muscles rippling beneath their coats as they stood tall. Despite their size, they were gentle creatures, carefully selected for their calm demeanor. But they were still animals, and animals have their own instincts. The more the tourists encroached on their space, the more uncomfortable they began to feel. The girl in the yellow dress, now just a few feet away from the horse, raised her camera and snapped a few photos. Her movements were quick and almost jerky, as though she was more interested in getting the perfect shot than in respecting the horse's space. She moved again, this time stepping closer and closer to the horse's flank. The horse shifted its weight, its muscles tensing slightly. The horse was sending signals, small movements that said, "I am not comfortable with this." But the tourists didn't seem to notice. They were too busy focusing on their photos and videos, sharing laughs and jokes, unaware that they were pushing the boundaries of respect. The guard, however, was aware of every movement the horse made. He had ridden this horse for months, perhaps years, and he could read the animal's body language as easily as he could read his own thoughts. When he noticed the horse's growing discomfort, he made a small movement with his hand, just enough to keep the horse still. He was trying to maintain control, trying to keep everything in line, but the situation was becoming more difficult. The tourists were not only being disrespectful, but they were also putting the guard in a difficult position. He had to protect the horse, his fellow soldiers, and the public, all while keeping his cool. It wasn't an easy task. As the young tourists continued their behavior, trying to get closer and closer to the horse, something happened that no one could have predicted. The horse, suddenly feeling cornered and frustrated, swished its tail violently. The movement caught the young man in the yellow t-shirt off guard, and he jumped back. He had been standing right next to the horse, teasing it and trying to get a closer look. Now the horse's tail had slapped him, and the sting of the impact left him startled and disoriented. The young man, trying to laugh it off, turned to his friends, but the humor didn't come as easily. He was visibly shaken. The others in the group, seeing what had happened, began to pull back as well. For the first time, the loud chatter and the joking stopped. There was a brief moment of awkward silence. The young man, realizing that the situation was more serious than he had originally thought, turned toward the guard, who was now looking at him with an unspoken warning. The tourists were beginning to see that they might have gone too far, but it wasn't just the young man who had been affected. The entire group began to feel a shift. The others who had been laughing and filming were now quiet, suddenly realizing the impact of their actions. The once light-hearted atmosphere had turned heavy. They had all been part of something they didn't quite understand. They had been poking fun at something that deserved respect, and now they were starting to see the consequences of their behavior. The horses were trained to stay calm, but they were not immune to being bothered. They could feel the frustration of being surrounded by a group of people who had no understanding of their role, and their patience was beginning to wear thin. The young man in the yellow t-shirt, still holding his arm where the horse's tail had made contact, looked around at his friends. They exchanged glances, their smiles now gone. It was clear they were all feeling the same thing, regret. The atmosphere had changed, and the group was now realizing that they had crossed a line. The guard, standing tall and unmoved, showed no emotion. He had been trained for situations like this, and he knew the importance of maintaining control. But the tourists had learned a valuable lesson, one they wouldn't soon forget. They had underestimated the seriousness of the tradition they were witnessing, and now they were learning that actions, even playful ones, can have consequences. It was an uncomfortable lesson, but it was one they would remember for the rest of their lives. The ceremony continued. The guards unmoved, the horses calm once again, but the energy around the tourists had shifted. They had come to see the changing of the guard as just a piece of entertainment. Now they were seeing it for what it truly was, a demonstration of history, discipline, and respect. The tourists, who had been laughing just moments ago, were now standing in silence, reflecting on their behavior and the lesson they had just learned. As the young man in the yellow t-shirt backed away from the royal horse, a feeling of unease settled over the entire group. What had started as a fun and carefree day of sightseeing in London had suddenly turned into something much more serious. The horse's sudden and forceful tail swipe had caught the group by surprise, and the laughter that had once filled the air was replaced with a nervous silence. For the first time, the tourists began to understand that they had overstepped their bounds. Their casual teasing, their attempts to get closer to the horses, and their jokes about the royal guards were no longer amusing. They had pushed too far, and now the situation felt uncomfortable, even tense. The guard on horseback, who had been so still and composed just moments before, remained calm. His eyes, sharp and focused, scanned the crowd, ensuring everything was under control. He had seen this kind of behavior before, time and again. Tourists, excited and unaware, often thought that the royal guards and their horses were there for their amusement. They didn't understand the level of discipline that went into these ceremonies, nor did they respect the tradition that the guards upheld. But the guard did not flinch. His face remained neutral, his posture unchanging. The only sign of any movement was his horse, which had shifted slightly in response to the tourists' actions. The guard, however, knew how to control the situation. He had dealt with similar distractions before, and he knew the importance of maintaining calm and order, especially when others failed to do the same. The group, now a little quieter, began to look at one another. They were no longer laughing. Some of them even exchanged guilty glances, realizing that their actions might have put the horses and the guards in a difficult position. The young man who had been so eager to tease the horse now rubbed his arm where the horse's tail had struck him. It wasn't a painful injury, but it was a sharp reminder of the situation they had created. As the group slowly moved back, trying to distance themselves from the horses, they became aware of how out of place they had been. They had treated this historical ceremony as if it were just another tourist attraction, like any other street performance or display. But this was no performance. The changing of the guard was a deep-rooted tradition, one that carried centuries of history, and it deserved respect. The young woman with the camera, who had been snapping photos so eagerly just moments earlier, now lowered her camera slowly. Her eyes, once focused on capturing the perfect shot, now seemed to be searching for answers. She had been so intent on getting close-up pictures of the horses and guards, but now she realized that she had been part of something much bigger. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of her actions settling in. She had crossed a line by invading the space of the horses and making them feel threatened, and now she wasn't sure how to make amends. Her friends stood in silence around her, each of them processing the situation in their own way. For the first time since they arrived at Buckingham Palace, the group of tourists stood still, their faces showing expressions of unease. No one knew exactly what to say. The moment of lightheartedness had passed, and it was clear that they had made a mistake. They had disrupted the calm of the ceremony, disrespected the guards and the horses, and now they were beginning to see the consequences of their behavior. The horses, although trained to stay calm, were still living creatures with their own instincts. They could sense when something was wrong, when they were being provoked or threatened, and they had reacted in a way that reminded the tourists that animals, no matter how well trained, could only tolerate so much. As the minutes ticked by, the tension did not ease. The tourists, feeling the weight of their actions, slowly began to drift away from the guards and the horses. It wasn't that they wanted to leave, they were still curious about the ceremony, but they could not shake the feeling that they had done something wrong. They had been so caught up in the excitement of the moment that they had failed to recognize the deeper significance of what they were witnessing. The changing of the guard was not just a spectacle for them to watch and photograph. It was a time-honored tradition, one that required respect and reverence. The group found themselves drifting towards the edge of the crowd, their eyes still on the guards, but their posture now more subdued. They had been part of something they didn't fully understand, and now they were left to reflect on their actions. They could hear the faint sound of the guards' boots as they continued to march in perfect synchronization, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves echoing through the courtyard. To the tourists, these sounds now felt different. They no longer felt like background noise or something to ignore. They felt important. They felt like a reminder of the history they had momentarily disrespected. The guard on horseback, meanwhile, had not changed his stance. He continued to perform his duties with unwavering focus, his eyes scanning the crowd for any potential issues, his posture as perfect as it had been when the ceremony began. The horse beneath him stood tall, calm once more. The animal seemed to sense that the tourists had withdrawn, and it relaxed, returning to its usual state of composure. The tension that had briefly hung in the air was slowly dissipating, but the tourists had learned an important lesson. They had learned that actions had consequences, and that some things, like tradition and respect for others, should never be taken lightly. As the ceremony came to an end, the tourists stood in silence. They had witnessed the precision, the focus, and the discipline of the guards and the horses, and they now understood why these ceremonies were so important to the British public. What they had seen was not a show for tourists. It was a tradition that had been passed down through generations, and it represented the strength and stability of the British monarchy. The tourists, now more aware of their surroundings, watched as the guards began to make their way back to their posts. The ceremony had ended, but the lessons from that brief moment would stay with them for a long time. The young man in the yellow t-shirt, who had once been the loudest in the group, now found himself in deep thought. He had come to London expecting to have fun, expecting to take funny photos and videos, but he had left with something far more valuable, an understanding of respect. He knew that in the future he would approach situations like this differently. He would remember the calm composure of the guards, the dignity of the horses, and the lesson that sometimes silence and respect spoke louder than words. As the tourists walked away from Buckingham Palace, they no longer seemed like a group of people eager to rush to the next attraction. Instead, they were quieter, more reflective. The atmosphere had shifted. They had witnessed not just a ceremony but a living tradition, and they would never again take it for granted. It was a reminder that sometimes the most valuable lessons are learned not through words but through actions, and in this case, through the simple yet powerful act of respecting those who had been entrusted with a great responsibility.